Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 22, and if you're new here and haven't seen any of the other videos in this series, don't worry, I will link a playlist at the top of the screen there so that you can go back and watch anything you might have missed. We're making a quilt on a garden theme and we're making roughly one block a week, and this week I thought you might want something nice and easy, using some ribbons and trims just to give some space to do a bit of catching up. And later in the video we're going to pair it with the block that we made last week, which is our garden path block. So I'll just take you around what I've got on my table. I've got my embroidery scissors. I don't need any paper scissors this week because we're just using fabric. And I've chosen my striped, pale blue striped background. I've cut a 20 by 20 centimetre block, and if you're wanting something similar, this is an 8mm stripe, so that's what you need to look out for. I've also got some rickrack. I'm going to use that over the join between the blocks a little bit later, and this I think is 1.2 or 1.5 centimetre rickrack, so it's a nice chunky one, chunkier than normal. I've also got some grosgrain ribbon, and I've got my green and my pale blue here, and this is a stitched edge ribbon, and we're going to make use of those stitches that decorate the edge of the ribbon a little bit later. And then I've got my embroidery thread, so I've got my red, which is Anchor 046, my yellow, which is 298, my lightest green, which is 255, my blue, which is 130, pink, which is 025, and my white, which is 001. And I've also just got some pins just out of shot. I've got my iron and ironing mat, and I might bring in a heat erase pen at some point. So we're going to start off by cutting some lengths of ribbon and attaching them to our backing fabric. So you just want to find the centre of your block and cut a length of ribbon that is just about the width. I'm eyeballing this. You don't need too much of an overhang because obviously we've got a seam allowance on all sides of this block, and the ends of the ribbon are going to be caught into that seam when we put our blocks together. So I'm just pinning this in place just to hold it steady while I stitch. I'm only going to use a couple of pins here. I've just made sure that's roughly level, and I'm going to take 2 strands of embroidery thread. Now you can use a coordinating thread for this one and sort of hide your stitches. I want to make a bit of a feature of my stitches, so I've got 2 strands of my yellow thread here, and I'm going to use an applique stitch to attach my ribbon to my backing fabric. So I'm using the woven edge of the ribbon as a bit of a guide, and I've brought my needle up through both the backing fabric and the ribbon just at the very edge, and then I tucked my needle right in against the edge of the ribbon and gone down just through the backing fabric, and that puts a tiny little stitch over the edge, just getting into a bit of a tangle here. So I'm just going to unhook my thread, just unpin and repin it just to release that thread. As soon as you've got a few stitches in, you can remove the pins, but I just want to get another couple in before I take that pin out permanently. So again, up through both layers, tuck the needle right against the ribbon and go down just through the backing fabric. And my stitches are maybe 1/2 centimetre apart here, and that's about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm just trying to keep them really regular, really small and neat, so that they just look deliberate and careful when I've finished. I don't mind that I can see the thread. I want that as a feature because this is going to be a little bit of a stitch sampler block, so we're just going to play around with colours and threads. I'm also thinking of the block that this is going to be attached to. So I'm going to stitch all the way down one side and then work my way back along the other, and then we'll come back and look at the next stage. So now I've got my green ribbon in place, and I'm going to add some pale blue either side. So I'm leaving 3 stripes between each strip of ribbon, cutting out the blue just to fit again. And while I'm here, I might as well cut out my other piece of green as well. So I'm going to add another piece of green above that blue and another one at the bottom as well. So again, just cutting these to fit, just eyeballing this. Yeah, so I clearly started in the wrong place. So how I didn't spot it at this point, I don't know. I was so frustrated when I'd finished filming, because if only I'd measured, I should have been on the blue stripe just below where the green is sitting, and that would have made it even, but everything was off centre, and so I had to do some jiggery pokery at the end. So just measure, please measure your block and make sure your first strip of ribbon goes in the middle. So now I've got 2 strands of my red thread here. I'm going to make something approximating a rainbow again, just like I did on my garden path block. So I'm going to stitch all those bits of ribbon down, and then we'll come back and look at the stitching that we're going to add. I still hadn't noticed that my ribbon was off centre, even though I've blatantly only got 3 stripes at the top and have got, is it 5 at the bottom? So yeah, I don't know what I was thinking, but now I'm going to put in some stitching to add a little bit of embellishment, and you can do whatever you like really, but I just thought I'd play around. I've got 2 strands of my white, and I'm going to use some of the stitching on this ribbon to add a little bit of stitched embellishment. So I'm coming up with my white thread just next to one of the little stitch decorations at the edge, and I'm missing one and going down through the next but one stitch at the bottom. So then I'm going to come back on myself and go up through that stitch. So I'm not going through the ribbon, I'm just sliding my needle under the stitches. So I find the stitch, move along 2 and go up through that stitch. So we're essentially doing a little woven herringbone stitch here, just lacing our new stitches into the stitch edge of the ribbon. So now I'll go back 1 and come down through that stitch, miss 1 and come down again through the next but one stitch, and then go back on myself and go up under that one. So then I miss 1 and go up through the next but one stitch on the top line, back on myself and go down, miss 1 and go down again, and then go back on myself and go up. So when we're going along the bottom line, we're going down and then back up, and when we're working on the top line, we go up and then down. So we go out of the ribbon and then back into it on whatever edge we're on. So we're always going out of the ribbon and then back in. So you can see it creates a sort of almost like a little loopy decorative line there. I love laced or woven herringbone stitch. I love herringbone stitch. I think it's one of my favourite stitches ever. But I just love it when it's laced into back stitch or running stitch. I think it's really cute. So obviously you can do the stitch by doing the running stitch first and then lacing it, or you can make use of the stitched edge of the ribbon just like we have. So I've finished that line of stitching, and I thought we could do something a little bit different on this white row here. So I'm just going along marking every 2 centimetres. Actually found the centre, still haven't noticed that my ribbon is off centre. And I thought we could have a go at some star stitches here. I thought that might look nice on this block. So I've got 2 strands of my red thread, and star stitch is basically 2 cross stitches that are offset. So I've come up at the top of my line and gone down directly below it, and then I've come up to the left in the middle and stitched across to the right, and you can see there that I'm just evening out that thread. You don't want to pull it too tight because that will cause your fabric to pucker, but you want it tight enough that it's not loopy. So I've brought my needle up at the sort of northeast point and gone down to southwest, and then come directly up to northwest and gone down to southeast. So if you think about the points on a compass, I've started at the bottom here, so I'm going straight up, and then I'm going to make a little bit of a diagonal stitch to come out to the west and going across to the east. So I tend to stitch it always north to south and then west to east, and then I've gone up to northeast and go down to southwest, and then up at northwest and go down again to southeast. And that's a star stitch really. It's very simple but looks really sweet. I think I quite like these as a decorative element on a piece of embroidery. I think they look really cute, and you can play around with them. You can make the verticals and horizontals longer than the diagonals, or vice versa. And if you want to, I'm going to do it on the next stitch, you can put a little anchor stitch at the centre. So I'll just show you that again. So I've started south, gone to north, bringing my needle out at west and going across to east, and then going up to northeast and coming down to southwest, just tightening up that stitch a little bit, and then up to northwest and down to southeast. And so if you want to, you can put in a little anchor stitch. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the centre and just hook it over the top of the centre point where all the stitches meet. And if your stitches are large, you might find that that helps them not be quite so loopy. It just makes them a little bit more secure. And I think as I was stitching this, I suddenly remembered that this is going to be a quilt that's going to be used, so I don't want lots of loops that can get caught and that might pull the stitching out of shape when it's being used. So that's why I thought it might be a good idea to put a little anchor stitch on. But if you're just doing tiny little stars, then you really don't need it. So I'm going to stitch those red stars, and I might put another line of stars above it as well. These are just suggestions. You could put any stitching you like on this. So I've gone in with some yellow as well, so I've put a line of yellow stars in there, and I thought it needed just something else. I might go back and put in lines of star stitch in those spaces as well. I'm not sure I do quite like it the way it is. So I thought what we could do is add some French knots in between. So I've got 2 strands of my blue, and just as a refresher, I've brought my thread through in between 2 of the stars, and then I sit my needle on top of that working thread, wrap over the top 2 or 3 times. I'm going to do 3, and then I'm holding those wraps with my finger while I pull the needle back, and I want to take the needle back down just a tiny distance away from where it came up, and I'm holding that working thread and keeping it under tension all the time, and then let it go at the last minute, and that gives you a really neat little French knot. So I'm going up in between my next 2 stars, hold my working thread and keep it under tension. You don't want to pull it too tight because you'll pull in your fabric. Sit the needle on top and wrap over the top a few times. Hold those wraps in place and take the needle back down, leaving a couple of threads in between where your thread came up and where it goes down. Hold that working thread under tension and pull through. So I'll just show you that once more. Through the fabric, hold under tension, needle on the thread, wrap over the top, needle back down through the fabric, hold the working thread under tension until the very last minute, and then let it go, and you get a nice neat knot. So I'm going to put the rest of those in. I'm doing blue in between the yellow stars, and I'm going to put some green French knots in between the red stars. So that's my stitching. I may add some more, but I thought that was okay for now. So I've brought in my garden path block, and you can see on the back I have marked in my seam allowance on the top and bottom, and that's because my blocks are going to go above and below each other. So I've just turned them to the side just so they fit neatly onto the screen. So this is the top of the garden path block, and that's the bottom of it. This is the top of my ribbon stripes block, and that's the bottom. I've lined them up as they're going to be. Just noticed that my ribbons are not in the centre finally, so I flipped over my ribbon stripe block so that it's on top of, just close it like a book, and that makes sure that it's the right way round. And I'm just lining up those seam allowance lines that I've made. I just measured it in the usual way. If you're not sure how to measure that and compensate for any cutting inaccuracies, I'll link a video at the top where we've done this before, and I'll show you the process in more detail. I'm just lining up those seam allowance lines and pinning my blocks together. Pinned it in the centre first, and I'm just smoothing out my block and putting in the rest of the pins. And I've remembered that we tend to put them perpendicular to the stitching line, and that helps us avoid getting puckers and lumps in our sewing. So just pin that in place, and I've just got some of my machine cotton, and I'm going to back stitch this together, keeping my stitches really small. So back stitch, really simple, bring the needle up, work forward 1 stitch and then back 2 stitch lengths, and then work back again to meet the previous stitch. So I've stitched all that together. I'm just pressing that seam open. So I've got my ironing pad out, and I'm turning my seam to the dark green fabric because it's the stronger colour. So I'm just pressing that seam flat and just working on that from the front as well, just to make sure that the seam is fully open, and that means that my blocks will be the right size. And that's our block join. So the last thing I'm going to do is just stitch some rickrack over that join, and I'm just lining it up very much like we did when we were stitching our ribbon on. So I'm just lining that up. I'm just making sure that the top of the bottom wave is lined up with my seam. So that means that it will be straight all the way along and nice and even. So I'm pinning it in the middle to start off with, and then smoothing it out to the left and then to the right again. This is just to hold it in place, and you can see me there just adjusting it just to make sure that the rickrack is lined up as it should be. I'm just taking some care over this, because if I pin it incorrectly, I'll stitch it incorrectly. So I'm just making sure that it's working and is nice and accurate and straight. It will stick out like a sore thumb if it's wobbly in the end. And I'm actually starting in the centre of this. I do find it easier with rickrack to start at the centre and then work to the left and then back down and then back to the centre. And I'm stitching it with an applique stitch just like we did with the ribbon. So bringing my needle up through both layers and down through just the backing fabric. And this time I'm using a coordinating thread, so I've got 2 strands of my white, and I'm just stitching that one in place in exactly the same way. So keeping my stitches nice and even, fairly close together, about 1/4 of an inch apart, and I'm going to work all the way up one side. Then I'm going to work back down on the green edge and then back to the middle on the blue, and I'm smoothing out the fabric and rickrack with my thumb and fingers as I'm going. There's our blocks complete, stitched on the rickrack. We've got our garden path block and our ribbon sampler at the top, and I really like this pair. I think the colours work really well together, and I just think it's really happy because the garden path block is quite busy. There's quite a lot going on. It's nice to balance it with a simpler, more spacious block at the top. So I haven't added any more stitching yet, but as we put the blocks together in a few weeks' time, we'll be able to see how busy the whole composition is, and I can always add stitching a little bit later. So do share your sampler blocks at #FSH23quilt, and if you've enjoyed this video, please do give us a like. It means a lot to us. It helps others find our video. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you want something similar, I will link some videos over here, and if you'd like to subscribe, do just click on our logo down here. It makes it really easy. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week making your ribbon sampler block, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.